So welcome everyone. This is another Slow Factory open education course. Happy Friday, as I said before. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about fashion and prison labor. My name is Teju Adisa-Farrar. I am currently here on unceded Ohlone land. The Chochenyo-speaking people in particular are the native people of Oakland, where I am currently. And I always like to encourage people to learn the indigenous communities whose land that you're on, especially as we begin to talk about this topic of fashion and prison labor, which also have to do with this sort of colonial land that we are all experiencing and how it affects our daily lives and even the way that we consume clothes. And sometimes we don't even think about all of the things that are connected to the fashion industry. And so the Fashion and series is really about talking about the ways we consume fashion, we dress ourselves, we express ourselves is sometimes connected to violent systems. And we're really looking to transform those. So this class looks at the history of prison, specifically prison labor as it relates to colonialism and globalization, economic domination. We're going to talk a little bit about the products that are made in prisons and some of the brands that have used prison labor, as well as address this question, can it be sustainable if it was made in prison? So we're going to start with a quick history of prison labor in the US. I could not do a world history of prison labor because it's so different and unique based on the different countries, but because the US is one of the largest imperial powers in the world and also has the largest prison population relative to its population, I figured I would give an example of the US since that's where I am. And I can see many of you are also in the United States. So prison really sprang from slavery, and particularly plantation slavery. Section 1 of the 13th Amendment, which was written in 1865, says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So the 13th Amendment is the abolition of slavery, or at least that's how we talk about it. But actually, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery everywhere except as a punishment for crime. So that means if you commit a crime or you are convicted of committing a crime, you can still be enslaved in the US. So 1865, plantation slavery was abolished, prison slavery was able to continue on in the form of punishment for crime. So this photo is from the Marshall Project. It's an archival photo from 1965, but when you first look at it, you could think that this is still during the period of slavery, and that's because technically it is. So Section 1 of the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but extended slavery into prison, and the Congress was able to control this system through legislation. So what happened was many plantations literally turned into prisons. Prisons and prison labor camps grew post-emancipation after the abolition of slavery. There was another source being created of cheap labor. So whereas with slaves, capitalists had this cheap forced labor, when prison labor and prison camps were growing in the US, it replaced slave labor with prison labor. So still, people who owned property, people who owned manufacturing, people who owned the means of producing products could still have a cheap source of labor despite the end of slavery. It also led the way for convict leasing programs. And convict leasing programs are essentially you can rent or lease a convict to do labor on your land or to work in your factory or whatever. And it actually turned out that the convict leasing programs were cheaper than having slaves because part of having slaves was having to maintain their health and wanting them to live long to do as much work as possible. But with prisoners, it was on the prisons themselves to maintain the health of the prisoners. So all you had to worry about was them working. You didn't have to worry about their health. So actually, convict leasing became an even more efficient source of cheap labor than slavery as the economy in the US started to develop. So the judicial system in the US was founded to maintain and institutionalize power hierarchies, one of which is Black people on the bottom and white people on the top. That's an oversimplification, but essentially slavery was Black people are slaves because they are Black, and white people are free because they are white. And so this judicial system, although it was developed in the process of abolishing slavery, it still maintained these power hierarchies. And among other tactics, it used prisons and prison labor to maintain these power hierarchies. And the way it did this was by restricting the mobility and opportunities of Black people. So similar to plantation slavery, where Black people had to remain on the space of the plantation, where they could not go other places without permission or without being led or guided by a white person unless they were escaping to freedom. Similarly, the judicial system and prisons in particular also restricted and confined the mobility and opportunities of Black people. It also created a cheap revolving labor force. So not only is this labor force cheap, but it's also revolving. There will always be more people who can be imprisoned. Therefore, there will always be more cheap labor. And it also reused the plantation landscape as a means of economic and racial domination. So literally some plantations turned into prisons, but also this idea of forced work on the plantation became forced work in the factory, or forced work on the farm, or forced work somewhere else. So it wasn't necessarily that plantations were no longer plantations, but they were remodeled as something else as the prison industrial complex developed alongside the development of the United States. So prison labor extended slavery, but it remodeled it as rehabilitation for crime. So rather than slavery being you are enslaved because you are Black, it became you are enslaved because you committed a crime and you owe a debt to society. So that leads us to ask, who is defining what crime is and what rehabilitation looks like? If crime is being defined by the same people who benefited from slavery, then there's going to be a vision of Black people automatically being criminals. And then when we think about who's deciding what rehabilitation looks like, if it's mostly decided by people who don't experience slavery, who don't experience oppressive power hierarchies, then how do they really know what rehabilitation looks like for someone who has committed what they define as a crime? So as we continue to discuss prison labor, it's really important to understand the thread of slavery that goes through the United States, not only as its foundation in the enslavement of Africans and the genocide against indigenous people, but primarily as needing a cheap labor force to uphold the imperative for profit. So unicorn, not unicorn, that would be much cooler. Unicor actually is the Federal Prison Industries. It was a government corporation that was established by Congress in June of 1934. And essentially Unicor was the first official prison employment contractor. So before Unicor, individual prison camps, individual prisons and jails would decide what type of labor they want to rent or lease the convicts out to, usually chain gangs, other types of public works. But Unicor was the official place that institutionalized prison labor as a means of a legitimate, cheap labor force. So as prisons grew and got more expensive into the 20th century, prison labor was initially marketed or advertised as something that offsets the price of incarceration. So we have to feed these prisoners, we have to house them, we have to clothe them. Therefore, their labor is offsetting some of this price. And so essentially this meant that Unicor helped to centralize prison labor under the control of the federal government. And Unicor proudly thinks of itself as a correctional program creating factories with fences. So we're also starting to see this American identity of factory workers and manufacturing and prison labor as being central to that American identity. So even if it's factories with fences, it's still factories. UNICOR mostly works with other government agencies. One of the main contracts that they've maintained is with the military. 50% of their sales are with the military, which means a lot of prison labor is about making weapons. And in 2012, UNICOR was allowed to sell to some private companies as well. We don't know what private companies UNICOR is allowed to sell to, but now we know it's not only a company working with the government, but it also works heavily with the private sector, which brings up some other issues about profitability. So prisoners are paid between 15 cents to $1.15 per hour. This range has been basically the same since the 20th century, the early 20th century, since the beginning of UNICOR. And along with this payment structure, prisons are allowed to take 80% of what the prisoners make to cover the cost of housing them. So again, there's this idea that prison labor offsets the price of incarceration. However, most prisons are actually public, which means they're funded by tax dollars, so essentially our tax dollars, and even private prisons usually are created from government contracts, which include heavy government subsidies. So actually, prisons don't need 80% of a prisoner's pay to cover the cost of their living, because that's already covered in a myriad of other ways. So we have to think about what things are created for, basically how they actually function in society. So we're going to talk a little bit about neoliberalism and prison labor, because this also has to do with the history of prison labor, and particularly why it's used by so many different industries. So neoliberal policies increased prison populations, made way for more private prisons, and created a resurgence of prison work programs. In the 1970s, politicians like Nixon, then later in the 80s, Thatcher and Reagan, pushed neoliberal policies that allowed for the global restructuring of labor, which this meant is finding labor wherever it can be the cheapest. So throughout the 1970s and 1980s, we're seeing a global reorganizing of labor, all to maximize profit. So one of the things that's happening is in the US, domestic labor movements are being crushed, unions are being crushed, and the social welfare, state spending on social services is heavily decreased. There's legislation that is reducing global trade expenses and global trade barriers for Western countries. So usually these happen through neo-colonial trade agreements where they benefit the West more than they benefit the countries that the West is in relationship with. We also see the geography of manufacturing in the US and Europe shifting to former colonies, so primarily countries in Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So we're seeing domestic manufacturing being outsourced at this point. Along with that, we see fashion brands moving their factories overseas to places with less labor laws and less environmental protections, and thus cheaper labor, where they can maximize the profit and make sure that the main profit margin is happening in the Western countries. And whatever profit would be needed to pay people, some of that is being saved because of the use of cheap labor. Additionally, we see prisons expanding in the 1980s, even though crime in the US was technically going down. There was this newly unemployed population because manufacturing was moving overseas, it was being outsourced, there was a restructuring of the agricultural sector. There are people who now don't have union jobs, they don't have jobs at all. We also see the insertion of crack into Black communities, facilitated largely by the CIA. And so we have the war on drugs being created. And this war on drugs, what it really did was create new crimes and new criminals, primarily from Black and Brown communities. So now we have all of these laws, all of this legislation related to the war on drugs. And so now there are more types of things you can be put in jail for, and you also have less economic opportunities because many of them have been outsourced. And so you're needing to figure out how to live in this new neoliberal world. And so essentially, neoliberal capitalism, which is usually what I'm talking about when I talk about capitalism, has led to the cheapest, least protected labor force being factory workers and largely garment workers, and then also incarcerated people. So this process of using prison labor is an economic global social process that many industries are involved in because of the way labor was reorganized in the 1970s and 1980s particularly. Prison labor is $1 billion industry. It is not just about offsetting the costs of incarceration. We already know that incarceration in some ways reproduces itself. And we know that it uses a lot of different sources of income to exist. And so prison labor is actually pretty profitable. Incarcerated workers are not entitled to the standard labor protections that people have fought for over the last century because they're not considered employees, because when you're put in prison, you're no longer thought of a citizen who has the same rights as people who are outside of prison. Additionally, incarcerated individuals who refuse to work can be put in solitary confinement and thus are coerced into working. So in the US and in many countries, working in prison is not mandatory. However, certain individuals, particularly prisoners who are Black, prisoners who are LGBTQIA, are forced into working and put in solitary confinement or in other really violent situations if they decide not to work. So we're going to continue on with some prison statistics and demographics. If you have questions, write them down or put them in the chat or use the Q&A feature. We're going to have a pretty good chunk of time at the end to talk through some questions and to answer some questions, because I know I'm going through this information pretty quickly and it's more of an overview, just so we understand what we're talking about when we are talking about fashion and prison labor. So the only countries in the world with private prisons are the United States, the United Kingdom, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia. Literally no other countries in the world allow private prisons. They only allow public prisons. So some of these things these countries have in common: mass genocide against Indigenous people, anti-Black racism, English imperialism, mostly led by white male politicians. So there is this correlation between what are the countries that have private prison and are using this prison labor force, and what are the countries that have histories and were born from sort of anti-Blackness, Indigenous erasure, imperialism, and patriarchy. The United States by far has the most people incarcerated relative to our population. So we're about 5% of the world's, but we have about 25% of the world's prisoners. In total, there are about 2.3 million people imprisoned in the United States. There are 1,833 state prisons, 110 federal prisons, 1,772 juvenile correctional facilities. So these are facilities where kids younger than 18, in some cases as young as 6, are put in prisons or jails or correctional facilities. We have 3,134 local jails, 218 immigration detention centers, 80 Indian country jails, as well as military prisons, civil commitment centers, state psychiatric facilities. So essentially there are several ways that people in the US are imprisoned in some way. And when we look at this chart that was created by the Prison Policy Initiative, what we also learn is that less than half of the people in prison actually committed violent crimes. So most of the people in prison did not commit violent crimes. There is a portion of people who have, but there's also a large portion of people who committed crimes related to drugs and related to property. And so in the US, almost every law is related to protecting property. So that means if you do anything to destroy property, you are going to go to prison in the same way that someone who has destroyed life is going to prison. And so that's what it means to live in a capitalistic society, when laws are constructed around protecting property over people's rights. And so a lot of people are in prison for burglary, for looting, for things related to property where they didn't actually harm people. Also, in local jails, a huge percent, more than half of the people in local jails have not been convicted of any crime at all. So they're being held in jail, having not committed any crime. So one of the things the 13th Amendment said was that you can become a slave if you have been convicted of committing a crime. But in the US prison system, many people are in jail and in prison, even though they have not been found guilty or have committed a crime. So there's still this sort of power structure that allows for certain people to be in prison, allows for certain people to be forced into prison labor, even though there's this part of the Constitution that is not always enforced, which is that you have to be convicted. Another important thing to note from this chart is that there's 44,000 youth in prison. So as I said, in the United States, as young as 6 years old, that means there are 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds in prison situations, in jail. So what do we need to do to create a situation where youth are not being put in cages, along with violent offenders who have actually killed and harmed people in a very different way than them? Blacks, Hispanics make up largest shares of prisoners. So relative to the population, this was in 2018, but now it's closer to 13% of the US population is Black, and 33% of the US prison population is Black. 16% of the US population is Latinx, and about 23% of the prison population is Latinx. 63% of the United States is white, but only 30% of the prison population is white. So actually, Black people and Latinx people, Indigenous people are disproportionately represented in prison and disproportionately for non-violent crimes. Similarly, in Australia, the Indigenous rate of incarceration is 2,253 in every 100,000 people, whereas for non-Indigenous people, it is 146. So vastly different. Indigenous people are being incarcerated at much higher rates than non-Indigenous people of Australia. So again, we see this colonial slavery landscape of Indigenous and Black people being on the bottom and white people being on the top is being reproduced even in our prison system, in our incarceration system. And so while Brown and Black people are not only the people in prison, they are overrepresented in this prison. They're overrepresented in being confined to a particular geography and being forced to do cheap labor. Black, Asian, and multiracial people constitute only 14% of the general population in England and Wales, but make up 25% of its prison population. So even again in the UK, where people of color are a smaller percentage than the US, they are still a larger share of the prison population, almost actually a quarter of the prison population. So globally, the prison labor workforce is mostly made up of Indigenous, Black and Brown, working class, and poor people. And across the world, people in poverty are more likely to end up in jail and prison than any other people. So let's talk about some of the products and brands that are made in prisons. Now that we understand the history a little bit, we understand how neoliberal capitalism perpetuates this history. We know that this is mostly Brown, Black, and Indigenous people who are being impacted by prisons and prison labor. Let's look at the products that are made. So as I said, many industries use prison labor: mining, agriculture, manufacturing, the military, fashion. Many more industries than this use prison labor, but these are some of the largest industries that use prison labor. What is made? Everything: furniture, car parts, makeup, clothes. Sometimes made in USA tags are added in US prisons. A couple years ago, some former inmates talked about how they were sent made in US tags from clothes made elsewhere in China, Vietnam, South America, and in prison, their job was to add these made in USA tags to these clothes as if they were actually made in USA. Now, there was a lot of controversy around this. Prisons said that this can't be substantiated, but the idea is that there are so many products made in prison, we don't even know that they're made in prison, and some of the products that are made domestically or that we say are made domestically are actually made in prison. So what are some of the companies that have used or currently use prison labor that you may know? Well, I'm sure you know McDonald's, Starbucks, Whole Foods, which is owned by Amazon, Walmart, British Petroleum, Verizon, American Airlines. There are many, many more. Several companies across the US currently use or have used prison labor. The other thing is that many large corporations, they contract out to companies who then subcontract to prisoners. And so this hides the type of labor that's involved in the supply chain. And it also makes unclear how and where our products are made. So companies are saying, we didn't know that that company subcontracts prisoners, or we didn't know that this corporation is connected to Unicorn, which uses prison labor. But the reality is that by hiding all of the things that happen in the supply chain, people are essentially not understanding how much violence is a part of the production of our clothes and our products and our garments. So some of the fashion brands that have used prison labor are Victoria's Secret. I think most notably it's Victoria's Secret. For some reason, Victoria's Secret was the main brand being lauded as the one using prison labor. And since the controversy arose from them using prison labor, they have stopped using companies that subcontract to prison labor. Jordans, which are shoes, were made in prison. JCPenney used prison labor. Nordstrom's, Eddie Bauer. So essentially, several fashion brands use prison labor or have used suppliers who then subcontract to prison labor. However, what is hopeful is that when brands have been called out, when people have said, this is terrible, we didn't know this, we don't want to support you, they have stopped using prison labor and suppliers that use prison labor. So calling out brands who are using labor and supply chains in a violent way is a really good tactic to get them to change their practices of labor. Essentially, prison labor in the US is incentivized. Companies who use prison labor can receive a $2,000 400 tax credit for every single inmate they employ under the Worker Opportunity Tax Credit. So actually, not only are you getting cheaper labor when you use incarcerated individuals, you're actually getting tax benefits to use incarcerated individuals. So actually, the incentives for prison labor are built into the judicial and legal and economic system of the United States in order to benefit people who want to maximize their profit at the expense of humans being used as forced labor and the degradation of the environment. So another question that comes up is there's inmates in prisons sewing, knitting, weaving, they're using, creating, learning skills, and they're also working in the fashion industry sort of behind a veil. So can they work in the fashion industry when they're released from prison? Well, mostly the answer is no. Many companies do not hire former inmates. They do not hire people who have been convicted of felonies. And in some cases, companies do not accept prison work as legitimate work experience. Some inmates who were formerly incarcerated have talked about literally sewing and putting together the clothes of fashion companies, and then upon release, trying to go work at the stores and not being accepted, not being allowed to have jobs because they were former inmates, because they were imprisoned. So essentially, this feeds into the cycle of people being sort of abandoned by society, not having economic opportunities, needing to survive, committing what we have defined as crimes, but really committing things to feed themselves and their families or to release all the trauma they're experiencing from society. They're then imprisoned, released back into society that does not give them services, support, financial opportunities, so then they're abandoned again. And this is why the recidivism rate in the US is so high. And what recidivism is when you're released from prison and then you go back into prison immediately. And so essentially, there are people, many of whom are Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, who are in this cycle of being abandoned by society, doing what they need to do to survive, which lands them in prison, being released back into the same circumstances, and then sort of going back into that cycle. And so this idea of a revolving cheap labor force is really what the current prison system does. It creates a situation where people do not have what they need in society. Therefore, they turn to violence and crime. They're put into a state system and then again released. So we need to think about how are there structures to give people economic opportunities and skill building that can be used outside of prison to not allow people to go to prison, but also when inmates are coming out of prison, how do we set up an industry, particularly in fashion industry, that allows them to transfer those skills to working for fashion brands and designers who they were working for in prison? Can sustainable brands be made in prison? So in addition to prison labor being used sort of opaquely behind the veil and brands not wanting people to know, now we're seeing sustainable brands coming out saying, actually, we're sustainable and we use prison labor. This is something that we're proud about. It's a means of empowerment. And so I want to talk about if it's possible for sustainability brands to be using prison labor in any way. And also the question about, is it ethical? Well, sustainability encompasses more than materials. It is about working conditions. It's about agency. It's about dignity. It's about being able to provide for future generations without violence or oppressive hierarchies. Ethics, on the other hand, is really about one's personal principles and values. These are based on your race, your socioeconomic status, your education. So, in my opinion, prisons are not ethical. But depending on where you come from or your background, you do believe that people who have committed a crime against society or another person should be put in prison and they should be working as punishment. Some people can believe that and it could feel ethical to them. The first brand I want to talk about is called Carcel, no doubt taking from the word incarceration. And it is a Danish company that uses natural materials and tries to reduce waste. And they primarily source silk made in a Thailand women's prison and wool made in Peruvian prisons. So Carcel says on their website that the main cause of female incarceration in Thailand and Peru is drug trafficking committed by single mothers who need to provide for their families. We have set up and run our own production sites inside of women's prisons in order to provide an opportunity for financial inclusion and skills development. So, what does financial inclusion mean in this case? Well, a wool sweater from Carcel made in a Peruvian prison costs about 285 US dollars, which is more than what their Peruvian seamstresses make in a month. So even though the seamstresses are paid, the financial benefit and profit mostly still goes to Carcel. So there's still this process of extracting cheap labor from former colonies. So although the women in Thailand and Peru are paid for creating the garments, Carcel still benefits from not having to pay them as much as they would have to pay a non-incarcerated person in Europe or the US. Most of the profit from Carcel's supply chain is at the point of advertisements, marketing, and consumers. And most of their consumers and most of the people they're marketing to are in Europe and the US because the average Peruvian person cannot afford a sweater over $200. So when we're thinking about a company like Carcel, who prides themselves as being a social justice company, we have to think about all the different ways that there's still this ability to maximize profit using cheaper labor and using post-colonial countries that are in interdependent relationships with Western countries, where the Western countries still extract most of the profit, even though the natural resources being turned into fiber and textiles and cloth and clothing is largely happening outside of the Western Hemisphere, and in fact, in these former colonies. Is it paternalistic? As I was learning about Carcel and reading about the way they frame their work, I was thinking about paternalism, and particularly the way that countries in the West use paternalism as a form of humanitarianism. So essentially, paternalistic culture is not trusting a person or community to know the right way to address the problems in their community. It includes believing that people outside of the community have the authority and expertise to determine solutions. And it also includes funding and treating the symptoms rather than the root cause of injustice. So most humanitarian efforts are paternalistic in the sense that they're like, we're coming from outside to improve your way of life, and your way of life is impoverished. but it's mainly impoverished because of the colonial relationships and the economic relationships with our countries. So even though our lifestyle and our country ideologies have largely created the system of poverty that exists in these countries, a paternalistic view says we're also going to be the ones to solve the problems for you, but they don't actually solve the root cause. So another company that I came upon that I think is a little bit better than Carcel, but still we should talk about this question of ethics, is Project Pieta. And they're a Peruvian street urban made in prison, and also a lot of the models for their clothing are people in prison, and these photo shoots are happening in prison. This was a label started by a French designer. He happened to visit an overcrowded prison and noticed that in this region, because of the culture of Peru and because of the alpaca and the environment, that many people have these skills of making fiber into cloth, of sewing, of weaving, of stitching. And so he said, there's this overcrowded prison. There's terrible prison conditions. They don't have anything purposeful to do. I want to create a project which is a brand, a streetwear brand in relation to these prisoners. So on the Project Pieta site, they say inmates are paid a portion of the sale price for each unit of clothing they produce, resulting in a reliable income they can send home to their families. Upon release, former inmates can continue working with Pieta or seek jobs at other companies with Pieta's recommendation or support. So the reason why I think they're a little bit better is because they create a pathway into the streetwear fashion industry and also working with Pieta after they're released so that they're not needing to do what they were doing to get into prison in the first place. But still, this project was created by someone seeing prisons as being terrible, as being horrible conditions, but then thinking, how can I put these inmates to work for a brand that ultimately is sold mostly to people outside the prison? The prisoners are not allowed to wear the garments that they make. And so although the prisoners are paid a portion from each unit of clothing that they make, we don't know how much that is. And we don't know how much agency they actually have in creating the streetwear brands. But I do think it's an interesting project. And if you look it up, there's some blogs from prisoners who have been a part of this project. There's a lot of information about how people experience this streetwear brand in relation to being imprisoned in Peru. So Peru, we're seeing, is a space where prison labor and fashion have collided a lot. And so there's this common thread of not only globalization, but essentially the criminalization of poverty. Both Carcel and Project Pieta identified poverty as a reason why people are in prison, not that they lack skills. In fact, many of them have these skills. They can stitch, they can sew, they can do patchwork, but there are not any economic opportunities in their country because of globalization and unequal trade relationships with Western countries for them to utilize these skills in a way that makes them able to live and feed their families. So they resort to doing things that we criminalize, such as stealing to get food or participating in the drug trade to get money so that they can survive. So really, the criminalization of poverty is the reason why there are so many incarcerated people and so much cheap labor. And as long as prisons are full of people who have no other options, there will always be a cheap or free labor force to exploit. So poverty itself is not sustainable. Poverty is systemic and will not be solved by American and European brands providing jobs to prisoners, whether the prisoners are in what we call third world countries or in our own backyard, because poverty and the criminalization of it is what has landed people in prison in the first place. So what are some alternatives to prison work, and how do we talk about abolition in this context? I want to give an example using Ethiopia's Mekele project. So this is a project in the northern region of Ethiopia. And the prison administration there has initiated a rehabilitation and skills program coupled with access to financial services that has enabled the creation of 31 active cooperatives that run successful businesses providing decent work for prisoners and inmates who are released from prisons. So in Mekele, in this part of Ethiopia, much like most everywhere else in the world, most of the people who are put in jail and in prison are put in jail and in prison because they were doing crime, what we call crime, related to being in poverty, not having what they needed, so needing to steal or hustle or do things that are deemed illegal in order to get what they needed. And so noticing that part of the issue is not having access to financial resources, not having access to opportunities to use your skills, not having a safety net is what lands people in prison. So they developed this whole project, which is about the prison, but also about the community surrounding the prison. And so one of the reasons why I think this is a better project than Carcel and Project Pieta is because there's a possibility to be a worker owner. This means that the workers who are creating the value by using their labor to create the product still retain some of that value. In the case of Carcel and in some cases Project Pieta, most of that value is sent to a different place to be sold. Whereas with the Mekele project, the fact that they are cooperatives means that worker owners all share the profits for the most part, and they're also all involved in the decision-making of how the business is run. So they have agency and dignity in their work because they're participating in how it's structured. Another thing that's good about this project and more sustainable is that the products that they create in these prisons are circulated within the region. So rather than creating garments that are mostly sent overseas, they create products that are based on the needs and culture of the community that the prison is in. So they're keeping that cultural element, that geographically specific element, that profit sharing within the region, within the community, and not using the carbon emissions to send them across the ocean or the carbon emissions involved in mass producing products and then sending them to the US and Europe. Additionally, there is a focus on providing inmates resources, training, and financial services so that they don't end up back in the cycle of criminalized poverty after they've been released. So again, creating a pathway to continue to participate in a meaningful way in the way that you make money is also something that helps people not go back to prison and gives them a sense of purpose. Additionally, many of the prisoners who leave this program become members of the community who work on community security and in some cases community policing. So what are ways that we deal with these issues within the community and provide resources to prevent people from going to jail in the first place? So the Mekele project, I think, is a good example of how it still works within the prison system, but creates pathways out of the prison system and is rooted in community. The other organization I want to mention is called Pink and Black. And on their website, they say, Pink and Black is an open family of LGBTQ prisoners and free world allies who support each other. Our work toward the abolition of prison industrial complex is rooted in the experience of currently and formerly incarcerated people. We are outraged by the specific violence of the prison industrial complex against LGBTQ people and respond through advocacy, education, direct service, and organizing. So Pink and Black was created to advocate for medical, human, and labor rights for LGBTQIA2S people in prison, as well as working towards prison abolition. So it started with a letter writing program from formerly incarcerated people to people incarcerated. And they kept hearing about human rights abuses, labor abuses, prisoners not being given their hormones, prisoners not being given the correct attention that they need, being disproportionately abused and forced into bad prison work jobs because they were LGBTQIA2S. So Pink and Black realized that the only way to give humanity to people who are incarcerated actually is to not have prisons at all. So not only do they work for advocacy on what's happening currently in prisons, but also towards the ultimate goal of abolishing prisons altogether, because that's the only real solution for humans to be treated humanely, is for there not to be prisons. And so when we think about abolition as it relates to fashion and the whole society that we've created based on this cheap labor force, we have to think about what needs to be in place in order for the fashion industry not to take advantage of prison labor. So the main thing is that we have to eradicate neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism, as I've shared, incentivizes using the cheapest labor force and using prison labor. We have to abolish prisons, which create a cheap labor force, which is necessary under capitalism. We have to be in solidarity with garment workers and inmates calling out brands who try to mystify workers' rights. So, really, in the process of working for a world without prisons, where people have what they need, and so they don't need to do what we consider crime to be in prisons, where we don't consider certain things crime at all, as we're working towards that type of society, what's crucial is being in solidarity with the people who are currently in the least protected, cheapest labor force, which is garment workers and inmates. We need to call out brands who are trying to blur or cover up the supply chains that they have created, which use this violence and which degrade people who work in the lowest rung of the supply chain and the environment. We need to be in solidarity with people who are talking about labor rights for garment workers, labor rights for inmates, working conditions, dignity, agency, better pay, prisons not being able to garnish wages from inmates to cover the costs of imprisoning them when they were forced to be there. Really, this process of creating a fashion industry that is not violent and extractive is really a prison abolition issue as well. So, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, abolition is deliberately everythingist. It's about the entirety of human environmental relations. So the idea is not to abolish prisons tomorrow and have no structures or safety nets in society for the people who are imprisoned. It's to create a society where people are not imprisoned because they are poor, where there is not systemic poverty because people have what they need, where there are not crimes related to basically your demographic opportunities, right? So the idea is that we restructure our relationship to each other and our relationship to the environment in order to create a society where there are no prisons. That is the idea of abolition. That is the idea of prison abolition. And I believe that in order for the fashion industry to be as sustainable as possible, because I don't think it's possible to be fully sustainable in the fashion industry because it does extract resources and create supply chains. But in order for the fashion industry to be more sustainable, it absolutely has to participate in prison abolition and the eradication of prison labor as a cheap labor force. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm looking forward to answering any questions for the next 15 to 20 minutes. I know that that was a lot of information to take in and it was not at all comprehensive. It was really an overview and I simplified some of the things to talk about this conversation in a way that is accessible. But I'm going to try to answer some of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. And I'm going to start with one, which is what's the difference between private and public prisons? So largely the main difference is that public prisons are funded by the government, which is essentially funded by taxpayer dollars. And private prisons are non-government entities, usually corporations or big firms. And in the US, there are two main big firms that create most of the private prisons. And they basically enter in a contract with the government. So they're a contractor of the government to run the prison, to pay for the costs of incarcerating people and to organize the way that work happens in their prison. So it's more of a public-private partnership when we think of private prisons, and largely the stream of financing for public prisons comes from like investment banking and Wall Street, which are the same types of economic streams that invest in fossil fuel extraction. So that's the main difference between public and private prisons. When companies stop using prison labor, do they simply outsource their labor to countries where workers' rights are worse? That's a good question. That is possible. If the main imperative for a company is to decrease the amount they have to pay in work, and paying people to work, then yes, if they're not using prison labor, maybe they do outsource that to somewhere in Southeast Asia, particularly if it's a fashion company. But I can't say for sure what individual companies do when they stop using prison labor. This is a really good question, and it's a hard question. How can we know which brands are using this type of prison labor so we can call them out? Well, the reality is that most brands keep their supply chains pretty opaque, meaning that we can't really see all of the different processes and relations that go into how our clothing is made. So, in general, it's hard to know all of the different hands and geographies that our clothes have made before they get to us. So, from what I know of the Victoria's Secret scandal, it was really heavy investigative journalism and organizing on behalf of garment workers' rights who exposed Victoria's Secret, realizing that they were working with a supplier and the supplier contracted to prisons for that labor. So it's hard to know. I don't really have a strong answer for that question, but trying to search the supply chains of brands, creating a culture where we're encouraging, not only encouraging, but really demanding brand transparency, really demanding to know all the hands that have touched our clothing, all the geographies that they've passed to, all the emissions, the carbon emissions and carbon extracted and carbon polluted that happens in the creation of the fiber and textiles for our garments, the factories that sew and stitch and design our garments together, the trains and trucks and ships that bring our clothes to us, usually from other countries. So by asking and demanding that brands tell us more about their supply chain, we could start to learn and gather and understand if they're using prison labor, what type of cheap labor they are using. Okay, there's so many questions. I'm not sure how to choose. One of the questions from Rachel is, would it be possible to create something similar to Mekele in the US? How would we be able to impact that other than contacting our representatives and pushing for prison reform? So absolutely. There are a lot of resources for turning businesses into cooperatives in the US. That is becoming something that's increasingly more accessible. And one of the benefits of cooperatives and the Mekele Prison Project is that when you are in a cooperative, you are having part in owning the company and making decisions in how the company runs. So it would be possible to create a sort of prison cooperative structure. Pottery Project, I believe it's called, is a cooperative that specifically employs former inmates in a pottery company to make and sell pottery. And so they're worker owners, they teach each other the skills they need, and then they sell pottery and share the profit and decide how the project runs. So there are a few examples of formerly incarcerated people being involved in cooperatives or people trying to create cooperative pipelines for prisoners. It would not be possible to create a cooperative in a prison that's private, primarily because legally the prisons would fight that and they have the opportunity to do that because they're private. I think it would be more viable in a public prison. And there are laws and legislations around cooperative businesses, so it could be possible to do that. Okay. Are the jobs of incarcerated workers chosen for them according to their skill sets or based on merit? So different prisons have different systems for work. In the case of the brands, the fashion brands that I mentioned, who were in Peru and Thailand, usually the people who are incarcerated in these places already have these skills. They already know how to sew, they already know how to knit, they already know how to stitch and weave, because it's part of their cultural expression. It's just part of the culture of the region. So they already have these skills. But in the case of Unicor, in many instances, they're training people to do certain factory manufacturing jobs. They're training people to build military weapons. A lot of people who go to prison are not people who actually know how to do some of these technical manufacturing jobs, such as building weaponry for the military. But Unicorp gives them skills and trains them on these skills. And then based on the contracts that they have, puts different prisoners into different industries. And I think this is also in relationship to what the prison decides about the type of prisoners. And I know that in maximum security prisons, certain levels, whatever level you're at, determines the different types of work opportunities you have, if you have them at all. And obviously, as some people learn certain skills in prison and get better at them, they're able to get specific type of jobs in prisons depending on their relationship with the wardens and all of these other relationships in prisons that I don't know a lot about. So I think it's sort of a case by case basis, and it depends on whether it's like a Unicorp large government contract, which is really this idea of factories with fences and manufacturing, versus like individual brands going to prisons in Southeast Asia or Latin and Central America, saying, are there folks with these skills, or noticing there are folks with these skills in in this region, and using the prison structure as a cheap labor force. So there are a lot of factors that go into how jobs are chosen. And I think it's really important to know that Unicorp uses half of Unicorp's contracts, about half come from the military, because the military is also one of the biggest polluters. The military emits more carbon than most countries in the world. The US military in particular, it has the most bases, more bases than any country in the world, and uses the most oil, more oil than most countries in the world. So the US military contributes to climate change profusely, and it uses prison labor to bolster this sort of machine. And people don't really have a choice. The inmates don't have a choice that they're participating in this violent, polluting system that also contributes to climate change. So when we're thinking about abolition, we're also knowing that it's related to climate change. We're knowing that it's related to environmental justice. We're knowing that these are not abstract, separate issues, but actually fashion is so much embedded into this question of prison abolition, anti-capitalism, globalization, and our environment. So I hope this was really helpful. I hope in the chat you're using each other's resources. I know folks have shared resources about different prison abolition activists, or they are prison abolition activists themselves, or they have books, they have resources. So please look to the chat for the resources, because a lot of folks have more information than me. I hope this overview was helpful for you. Feel free to message me or tag me on Instagram at Miss Tej, and to continue to learn from these open education, slow factory classes, and work towards this revolutionary mindset, because we can transform the world. We can transform supply chains. We can shift to globalization. We can think about bioregions, community-based initiatives, natural fibers, consuming less. We can do all of that as long as we understand how all these systems are connected, and that abolition is at the root of this. So thank you all for coming. Happy Friday. I hope you have a good day. And I hope you're thinking about ways that you can consume more sustainably, more ethically, and think about the revolutionary notion of abolishing prisons completely.